If you don't know about flyer deals on Instacart, this message is for you. Flyer deals are like strolling through your favorite store looking for deals, but you're scrolling your phone, and maybe you're in bed. Because getting delivery doesn't mean you have to miss deals like you'd get at the store, like the one creamer that doesn't make your stomach hurt, or the pasta sauce you can't not buy when it's on sale. So download the Instacart app, shop flyers, and never miss a deal on one of your favorites. Plus, get delivery in as fast as 30 minutes.
Hey there, this is Alexis Knight, and welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. I am your host, guiding you through cases that have moved through the courts and have reached a conclusion, but they left the public divided. These are not your typical cut and dried cases. These are the ones where the facts might be clear, but the truth? Well, that's another story. Today here, we are going to dive into a case that I guarantee many of you think you know. Okay, but trust me, there's always more to the story than meets the eye. This is the tragic tale of Conrad Roy and Michelle Carter, and it's a case that forces us to ask some of the hardest questions about accountability, influence, and the line between encouragement and coercion. Conrad Roy's death in 2014, it was ruled a suicide. A young man with his whole life ahead of him, grappling with mental health issues. But this wasn't just a straightforward case of a life taken too soon. What followed was one of the most divisive court cases of the decade, with Michelle Carter standing trial for involuntary manslaughter, convicted for sending text messages urging Conrad to take his own life. But was Michelle the cold-hearted villain that the prosecution painted her to be? Or was she just another victim of mental health struggles caught in a relationship that spiraled out of control? Many of you might remember the media frenzy, Michelle's infamous text, "Just get back in," it said, and the shocking revelation of their text exchanges. But what if I told you the story goes even deeper than those text messages that we saw all of the time? What if there were aspects of this case that you never heard before? Elements the media did not cover, or details lost in all the sensationalism that surrounded it? Well, today we're going to peel back the layers, examining not just the facts, but the underlying psychological dynamics that made this case so complicated. Because this isn't just a story about guilt or innocence, which is what makes these cases so unique. It's about the power of influence in this case. In these reviews, we're looking at cases in different categories. This one is under the influence. What happens when you are under the influence of another, or maybe a mental condition of your own? It doesn't always have to be under the influence of, say, drugs or alcohol. This case is about the power of influence and the limits of responsibility and the blurred lines between emotional support and manipulation. Conrad Roy was not just a name in a headline. This was a real person who had struggles and dreams, and a story that we're going to honor today. And Michelle Carter, well, she's more than the infamous texting suicide case poster child. She is a young woman with her own vulnerabilities, and the question of how much she truly influenced Conrad's final decision is far more complex than you might think. So as we break down this case, I invite you to keep an open mind. There's a reason this story continues to haunt the public conscience. Let's figure out why. All right, let's dive in. The Conrad Roy and Michelle Carter case is one of the most rare situations that makes you stop and think, what is the boundary between helping someone and harming them? How much influence can one person have over another's decision to end their own life? And where does the line between empathy and manipulation get crossed? At the heart of this case is a single unsettling question. Did Michelle Carter actually cause Conrad Roy's death? Or was she simply a misguided, mentally unstable young woman who made a terrible mistake? Let's take a step back and consider the dynamics at play. Conrad Roy was a teenager struggling with a deep-seated depression and anxiety. He had attempted suicide before, and he often confided in Michelle, someone he saw as a confidant, and in many ways, his emotional anchor. Their relationship was primarily digital. Most of their communication happened over text messages. They rarely saw each other in person, which is important because the influence Michelle had over Conrad was conducted entirely through the words she chose to send him. So it's easy to look at this case and think that Michelle Carter simply manipulated Conrad Roy into taking his own life. Cut and dried, done. After all, the text where she told him to get back in his truck are burned into the minds of anyone who followed this trial. But the truth is, there is so much more to this case than just a few damning messages, guys. What was Michelle's mental state during this time? How did Conrad's vulnerability and repeated pleas for help affect her judgment? Was Michelle herself a victim of unresolved mental health issues, or was she consciously pushing Conrad toward his tragic end? Well, the prosecution argued that Michelle acted with intent. They pointed to the text, to the moment when Conrad was having those second thoughts, and Michelle effectively told him to stop hesitating and just go through with it all. They made the case that she wanted Conrad to die and that her encouragement was the final push he needed. But the defense, they raised a critical counterpoint. Michelle was not some manipulative mastermind. She was a vulnerable teenager herself, and she was struggling with depression and social isolation. In her mind, she thought she was helping Conrad in a twisted way by supporting what she believed was his decision, what he wanted. And then, of course, there is the broader social question. How responsible are we for the words we say to others, especially in a digital age? In a world where people live much of their lives online, how much power can a single text message really have? Can it be enough to convict someone of manslaughter? If you tell someone to do something in the moment of emotional distress and they do it, is that fault yours or theirs? Michelle's defense attorney argued that her texts were nothing more than words, and that Conrad made the decision all by himself. After all, he had tried to commit suicide before, long before Michelle entered his life. But the prosecution saw it differently, and they argued that Michelle's words weren't just casual comments. They were commands delivered to someone in an incredibly fragile state. Her texts, they said, were the equivalent of a loaded gun handed to someone who was already on the edge. It's a moral gray area that has sparked debates across the world. Was Michelle Carter responsible for Conrad's death because she encouraged him to follow through? Or was she merely a troubled teenager who made a mistake that the law has been harsh in punishing? We also need to consider the public's perspective of this case. That's what we're doing here. Many people formed opinions based solely on those texts that were released to the media, which painted Michelle in a very specific, damning light. The public saw her as cold, heartless, and indifferent to Conrad's suffering. But were these texts the whole picture? When you take the entire context of their relationship, does it change how we view her actions? Michelle Carter was sentenced to 15 months in prison for involuntary manslaughter. But that sentence raises its own questions. Was that enough? Was it too much? Should she have been sentenced at all? Or was the court just making an example out of her? These are the questions we are going to explore as we move through this episode. And by the end of it, I hope you will have a clearer sense of where you stand in this case. You will know a little bit more. And maybe you can think about whether justice was truly served. To fully understand the complexities of this case, we have to start with the two individuals at its center, Conrad and Michelle. Conrad was 18. He was from Massachusetts, and to the outside world, he seemed like a typical teenager. He had a job, he went to school, he was close with his family. Behind closed doors, Conrad was battling severe depression and anxiety, struggles that he had been facing for years. His mental health issues ran deep, and they were exacerbated by his parents' divorce, struggles at school, and his own internal battles with self-worth. By all accounts, Conrad was a young man trying to find his place in a world that often felt overwhelming and unforgiving. His family tried to support him, but despite their best efforts, Conrad made multiple attempts to take his own life. Michelle Carter, on the other hand, was a teenager also from Massachusetts, different city, just a year younger than Conrad. And like Conrad, she also dealt with her own emotional and psychological challenges. She had struggled with an eating disorder and was known to be socially isolated, having few close friends at school. Despite their physical distance, though, the two teenagers formed a relationship that was primarily online, exchanging thousands of text messages over the course of their friendship. What initially started as a support system for each other would eventually become something much darker. In the months leading up to Conrad's death, he expressed suicidal thoughts to Michelle numerous times. He confided in her about his feelings of hopelessness and his desire to end his life. Now, initially, Michelle seemed to offer support, urging him to seek help and telling him that things would get better. But over time, the tone of her messages shifted. Instead of encouraging Conrad to seek help, she began to encourage him to follow through with his plans to die. On July 12th in 2014, Conrad drove his truck to a Kmart parking lot in Fairhaven, Massachusetts, where he attempted to end his life by carbon monoxide poisoning. At some point during this attempt, he gets out of the truck. He's panicked, and he calls Michelle. And this is where the infamous text message exchange occurred. Michelle, instead of urging him to go seek help or call emergency services, she told him to get back in. And Conrad followed her instructions. And shortly thereafter, he died in his truck from carbon monoxide poisoning. When investigators later examined Michelle's phone, they found a chilling series of text messages leading up to Conrad's death. Not only had she encouraged him to go through with his suicide, but she had also reassured him when he expressed fear or doubt. In the days leading up to his death, she sent him multiple messages, asking him when he planned to do it and why was he hesitating. One of the most damning messages was when she wrote, "You keep pushing it off and saying you'll do it, but you never do." She seemed to push Conrad toward the edge at a time when he was really struggling to hold on. He's trying to figure out if he's good enough and he can't even kill himself. Now, in the wake of Conrad's death, Michelle's behavior raised further suspicions. She texted Conrad's family expressing concern over his disappearance, and then she even helped organize a fundraiser in his memory. But behind the scenes, she sent text messages to her friends, admitting that she had known where Conrad was and what he was doing the night he died. "It's my fault," she wrote to a friend. "I could have stopped him. I was on the phone with him and he got out of the car because it was working and he got scared and I told him to get back in. I could have stopped him, but I didn't." These text messages formed the crux of the case against Michelle Carter. The prosecution argued that her words were the final push that led to Conrad's death and that without her encouragement, he might still be alive today. And they painted her as a manipulative, cold-hearted teenager who preyed on Conrad's vulnerability and pushed him toward his death for reasons that remain unclear. The defense, however, had a very different take. They argued that Michelle's texts, while troubling, were not the direct cause of Conrad's death. Conrad, they said, had a long history of mental health struggles and suicidal thoughts long before Michelle entered his life. And they pointed out that Conrad had attempted suicide multiple times before and that Michelle's messages were not the deciding factor in his death. The defense also highlighted Michelle's own mental health issues, arguing she was not in a stable state of mind during all of this. The trial itself was a media spectacle, with the courtroom packed and every detail of the case dissected by the public. Michelle's defense attorneys emphasized that her messages, while disturbing, were not illegal. They argued that it was Conrad's decision to take his own life and that Michelle should not be held responsible for actions that were ultimately his own. The prosecution, on the other hand, they focused on Michelle's responsibility as someone who knew Conrad's mental state and still encouraged him to go through with his suicide. They highlighted the fact that Michelle had not once tried to stop Conrad or call for help, even when she knew exactly what was happening. For them, her inaction was as damning as her words. In June of 2017, Michelle Carter was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter. The judge ruled that her words directly contributed to Conrad's death and that she had a legal duty to intervene and prevent his suicide. Michelle was sentenced to 15 months in prison, a sentence that sparked further debate about whether the punishment fit the crime. When the trial of Michelle Carter began in 2017, in June, it became clear that this was not a simple case of criminal justice. This was a case that forced both the legal system and the public to reckon with new questions about technology, mental health, and the limits of personal responsibility. At the heart of the trial were two competing narratives: the prosecution's portrayal of Michelle as a manipulative instigator of suicide, and the defense's argument that she was a troubled teenager who was not ultimately responsible for Conrad Roy's death. Can one mentally disturbed person, guys, be responsible for the actions of another mentally disturbed person? These are the confusing questions. From the outset, the prosecution painted Michelle Carter as someone who had actively encouraged Conrad to end his life, right? For them, the text messages Michelle sent were not just idle conversation or misguided support. They were deliberate attempts to pressure and coerce Conrad into committing suicide. This was the goal. According to the prosecution, Michelle's influence on Conrad was not passive. It was active. It was intentional and malicious. One of their key arguments was that Michelle's messages amounted to what was known as involuntary manslaughter under Massachusetts law. This charge meant that Michelle had caused Conrad's death not by physically harming him, but by exerting psychological pressure that was so intense and persuasive that it led directly to his death. Prosecutors argued that Michelle's words were akin to handling Conrad a loaded gun and encouraging him to pull the trigger. The text messages themselves were the prosecution's most powerful evidence. They painted a stark picture of Michelle's encouragement over several weeks, with the prosecution zeroing in on the message in which she told Conrad to get back in. In quotes, you'll see it around, get back in. The truck, after he had exited, he was panicked and unsure of what to do. For the prosecution, this was the tipping point, the moment when Michelle had crossed that line from a passive observer to active participant in Conrad's death. Because, of course, if we see someone who's trying to kill themselves, jump off a bridge, right? We see this on TV and movies and everywhere else. And you're waiting for that moment where that person can talk them down, right? Because any normal person, right, sane person would want to stop another from committing suicide. But here we have two mentally disturbed people. So again, it just makes it complicated. And then on top of the text messages, the prosecution also argued that Michelle's behavior after the death also revealed her guilt. Prosecutors pointed out that Michelle had lied to Conrad's family and to her friends about her knowledge of his suicide, even as she texted them expressing concern for his whereabouts. According to the prosecution, Michelle's admissions to her friends that she could have stopped Conrad but chose not to were proof that she understood the role she had played in his death. Or could it be that she's feeling guilty? Now, in addition to the text messages, the prosecution also presented expert testimony to bolster their case. Psychologists testified that Michelle's actions were consistent with someone who had deliberately taken advantage of another person's mental fragility. And they argued that Michelle knew exactly what she was doing when she urged Conrad to kill himself, and that her actions, they went far beyond what could be considered normal teenage behavior. And let's remember, we are talking about teenagers here, not adults. Makes it more complicated. Perhaps, though, the most damning aspect of the prosecution's case was their argument that Michelle had a legal duty to act. According to Massachusetts law, if someone is aware that another person is in imminent danger of harm, they have a legal obligation to intervene to help that person. Does this apply to minors? I'm actually not sure. But the prosecution contended that Michelle had failed in this duty, and she knew Conrad was in immediate danger, yet she chose to encourage him to continue rather than calling for help. In the eyes of the prosecution, Michelle Carter was not a misguided teenager. She was someone who had actively encouraged a vulnerable young man to take his own life and should be held accountable and should be responsible for that act. Conrad was 18 and she was 17 at the time, just a reminder. Okay, now let's go over to the defense because, of course, they took a different approach. Their argument was based on the idea that Michelle Carter's text messages, while troubling, were not enough to convict her of involuntary manslaughter. They argued that Michelle had not physically forced Conrad to take his own life, nor had she been present when he died. And so in their view, Michelle's words, while cruel, in hindsight, did not meet the legal standard for causing someone's death. This is tricky. The defense emphasized that Conrad had been suicidal long before Michelle entered his life, and they pointed to his history of depression and anxiety and those previous suicide attempts as proof that he was already on a path towards self-destruction, with or without Michelle's influence. They argued that Conrad had made his own decision to end his life, and that Michelle's texts, while hurtful, they didn't constitute a direct cause of his death. One of the defense's strongest arguments was that Conrad had ample opportunity to change his mind, and they pointed out that he had driven to the Kmart parking lot all on his own, he had obtained the equipment to kill himself all on his own, and that he had attempted suicide multiple times before. And so in their view, Conrad's decision to stay in the truck and go through with his suicide was his own, not something that could be pinned on Michelle. The defense also highlighted Michelle's own mental health struggles, and they presented evidence that Michelle had suffered from an eating disorder, depression, and social isolation. Her mental state, they argued, was far from stable during the time she was texting Conrad. According to the defense, Michelle was not in a position to make sound decisions or to fully understand the consequences of her actions. They argued that she had been trying to help Conrad in her own misguided way, but she never intended for him to actually die. In fact, the defense presented a counter-narrative in which Michelle saw herself as someone who was trying to support Conrad in his decision that she was trying to help a friend do what he wanted to do. They argued that in her mind, she was providing him with the emotional support he needed to follow through with what she believed was his chosen path. The defense contended that Michelle was acting out of a deep-seated desire to help, rather than harm Conrad. We see this, and we saw this in some other cases. The one where the woman drowns her children, she thought she was helping them. And they took issue with the fact that people said, hey, Michelle had a legal duty to intervene. They argued that it was unfair to hold Michelle responsible for Conrad's suicide when she was not even there, when her own involvement had been through text messaging. In their view, the prosecution was attempting to criminalize Michelle's words rather than focus on Conrad's actions. And then finally, the defense argued that the case had been blown out of proportion by the media, and they pointed to the widespread coverage of Michelle's texts as evidence that the public, and by extension the jury, had been unduly influenced by sensationalist reporting. And in their view, Michelle had been turned into a villain by the media, and the prosecution was capitalizing on that image to push for a conviction. Ultimately, this case came down to a legal question that was as unprecedented as it was difficult. Can words alone be enough to convict someone of manslaughter? In most criminal cases, there's a clear physical action that leads to a person's death. But in this case, the prosecution argued that Michelle's texts were the weapon that she used to kill Conrad. It was a novel legal theory, and one that would set a precedent for how digital communication is viewed in the eyes of the law. And to this, the defense countered by arguing that Michelle, if she was convicted, this would be an open door for an endless number of cases where people would be held responsible for the actions of others based on words alone. And they warned that such a conviction would have a chilling effect on free speech, especially in the digital age where much of our communication happens through text messages and social media. Now, in the end, the judge sided with the prosecution. He ruled that Michelle's words were not just casual conversation, that they were a form of coercion that directly contributed to Conrad's death. By telling him to get back in the truck, Michelle had crossed a line from emotional support to criminal conduct. Even after the conviction, the legal and moral questions surrounding this case, they continue to linger. It's bothersome. It's disturbing. Was Michelle truly responsible for Conrad's death, or was she a scapegoat for a tragedy that was bound to happen? It's tragedy on both sides. And what does this case mean for the future of digital communication and personal responsibility? How many of you are looking through your text messages right now for that recent fight you just had? I mean, it's a thing. Even though the legal outcome of Michelle Carter's trial may seem final, the public debate surrounding this case is anything but settled. To this day, the story of Conrad Roy and Michelle Carter continues to spark passionate arguments about guilt, influence, and accountability. What made this case so unique, so controversial, wasn't just the tragic death of a young man, which was tragic, but the larger societal issues that it brought into focus. At the heart of it all is the question, how much responsibility do we bear for the words we say, particularly in the digital age? For many people, the idea that someone could be convicted of manslaughter based on a text message, this alone just feels uncomfortable. Texting someone can put you in prison. After all, words, while powerful, have traditionally been seen as distinct from actions. In a society that values free speech, can we really hold someone criminally responsible for something that they say? The Michelle Carter case challenges this notion, suggesting that words, particularly in a vulnerable and high-stakes situation like Conrad's, can be just as harmful as physical actions. One of the most significant factors that contributed to the public's perception of this case was the media's portrayal of Michelle Carter. From the moment the texts between Michelle and Conrad were released, the headlines were unforgiving. The most infamous text, "Just get back in," was splashed across news outlets worldwide, painting Michelle as cold, heartless, and manipulative. But was this media narrative the whole story? And when do we get to prosecute the media, maybe, for actually starting the story in the first place? Sometimes, right? They have a lot of power. Is media news? Because we watch the news thinking we know things. They told us about these texts. That's all we need to know. And oh my goodness. And then we as humans out here in the public, we stop looking. We don't go any further. We have accepted the media as truth and the final decision. So what kind of weight is put on us in the public for what we do, siding with the media, without knowing the rest of the story? The prosecution here had access to thousands of text messages between Michelle and Conrad, but they only made a few public. Did you know that? Because we think we see it all when we see it in the news, right? But these select texts, taken out of the context of their complicated relationship, well, it became the foundation for Michelle's villainous portrayal. The public view saw only the words of Michelle in the worst way, without understanding the mental health struggles both she and Conrad were facing. And let's face it, the media and the courts, they love the public because if they can hook you, they can win. But what responsibility do you bear in the public without finding out the rest of the story? In this case and in many cases, this selective coverage shaped public opinion in a way that was almost impossible to counter. I mean, especially given how quickly social media amplified the most shocking elements of the story, and pushing someone to suicide, well, that's never going to look good, of course. But all of this raises an important question about the role of media, right, in shaping justice, which is what I was just saying. While Michelle's texts were undoubtedly disturbing, was the public truly given the full picture of who she was and what her relationship with Conrad looked like in its entirety? Did the media rush to judgment, creating a narrative that made Michelle seem far more calculating than she might have been? These are the questions that linger long after the verdict is handed down. We question verdicts. We do, don't we? Another layer of complexity in this case is the role of mental health. Both Michelle and Conrad were struggling with significant mental health issues in the months prior to this death. Conrad's battle with depression and anxiety was well documented, that he was in an extremely fragile state of mind. But Michelle's mental health was less scrutinized in the public eye. Even though she had her own history of depression, eating disorders, and social isolation, we didn't hear about all of that. We saw her as a villain. I'm not saying she wasn't, guys. I'm saying we prejudged without knowing everything. The public did. How did this all end up? Was it fair? The defense argued that Michelle's own struggles clouded her judgment and that her texts encouraging Conrad to end his life were not the words of someone who was stable. Certainly weren't the words of a manipulative mastermind, but they were the words of a vulnerable teenager who had convinced herself that she was helping a friend. And this raises broader questions about how the legal system handles cases involving mental health. Should Michelle have been held responsible for actions she may not have fully understood, and certainly didn't understand the consequences of due to her own mental state? And more importantly, how do we balance compassion for mental illness with the need for accountability in cases where someone's life is lost? The controversy surrounding this case forces us to think more critically about mental health in our legal system and our world. I mean, so much has happened that's new. You know, all the urgent cares that are popping up, have we seen any digital mental support things popping up anywhere? Anybody? At the center of this case is a key issue that resonates deeply in today's world, right? The power and permanence of digital communication. We live in an era where so much of our relationships, our conversations, and our emotions are filtered through screens. Text messages, social media posts, the online exchanges, They're often the primary ways we connect with each other, right? But what happens when the words typed into a phone carry real-world consequences? The Michelle Carter case has raised important questions about the nature of digital responsibility. Can you be held responsible for someone's death because of something you said in a text? Now, in the past, the idea of words being weaponized in such a way would be very far-fetched. But we understand a lot more today, either on the phone or in person, about what words can do, the pressures. But today, in a world where so many of our interactions are digital, almost all of them, we're starting to realize that the lines between speech and action are not as clear as they once were. We're young as humans. We have a lot to learn. I mean, for many, this case, though, sets a dangerous precedent. So if Michelle Carter could be convicted of manslaughter based on her text messages, does this mean anyone who says something hurtful could face consequences? What about all the cyberbullying or online harassments? Where do we draw the line between cruel words and criminal acts? These are questions that remain unanswered, and the implications of this case for future battles in the legal world are still being debated. Ultimately, the Michelle Carter case remains controversial because it taps into so many deep-seated fears and uncertainties in our society. Within ourselves, it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about mental health and digital communication and the limits of personal responsibility. It challenges our notions of justice and accountability, and it asks us to consider what role, if any, the public's perception should play on the legal system. And that's what I was saying earlier. Who is ultimately responsible here? If Michelle Carter was not clear and influenced Conrad, and then the prosecution influences the media, and the media influences you, and then you decide, and then you want Michelle in jail and prison and all of this, and the legal system takes your pressure and puts her in prison. How's that all working out, guys? How's it all working out? For some, Michelle Carter's conviction was a victory, a sign that the legal system can adapt to the complexities of the modern world and hold people accountable for their actions, even if those actions are communicated through a screen. And for others, it's left as a troubling overreach and a sign that we are criminalizing speech in a way that could have unintended consequences for future cases. The case of Conrad and Michelle, it's not just a case about this death. It's a case about the new realities of living in a digital age where words can carry as much weight as actions, and where the boundaries between support and influence and coercion are harder to define than ever before. All right, guys, as we have walked through this tragic story of Conrad and Michelle here, one thing is clear. This case is not easy to categorize or commit to, right? Can you commit to one side or the other for sure, without a doubt? Was Michelle a villain, or was she a victim herself? Did her words truly carry the weight of manslaughter? Or was this a tragic case of misguided support spiraling into something far darker? These questions remain as divisive today as they were back then during the trial. And the more we dig into the details, the murkier the answers become. On one hand, Michelle Carter's words, particularly the infamous "get back in" text, are undeniably disturbing. To know that Conrad, a vulnerable 18-year-old boy, was wavering in his decision to end his own life, and then have someone who claimed to care for him encourage him to follow through, that is just chilling, no matter who you are. The prosecution's argument that her words pushed Conrad over the edge is compelling. I mean, after all, Michelle had a duty as someone who knew Conrad was in danger to intervene, and instead, she chose to stay silent, and she even urged him on. But as we've seen, this case is not black and white. The defense's portrayal of Michelle as a deeply troubled 17-year-old girl struggling with her own mental health complicates the narrative, doesn't it? Was she truly capable of understanding the impact of her words? You know, young teenagers, they feel very loyal to those who they are friends with. Could she really and genuinely have felt like she was helping Conrad get out of this ugly world and do what he wanted in his darkest moments? When viewed through the lens of her own fragility, Michelle's actions can seem less like those of a heartless manipulator and more like those of a teenager tragically out of her depth. And then there's the larger question: can words alone, sent through a screen, be enough to hold someone accountable and responsible for another person's death? In a digital age where much of our communication happens through text messages and social media, the implications of this case extend far beyond Michelle and Conrad. Are we as a society ready to hold people accountable for the things they say online, especially in situations where those words might lead to real-world consequences? Or does this open the door to punishing speech in ways that could set dangerous legal precedents? As you out there, listeners, think back on this case, just try to consider what you would have done, really. If you were in Michelle Carter's position, would you have tried to save Conrad? Or might you also have found yourself swept up in all of his pain, unsure how to help? Could happen. And what of Conrad Roy himself, a young man whose life was filled with pain? He struggled to find peace in a world that often felt overwhelming. Was his death inevitable? Or could it have been prevented if someone had intervened sooner? The court of public opinion will always have divided views on this case. But now that you've heard the details, it's up for you to decide. Was Michelle Carter guilty of manslaughter? Or was this simply a tragic case of two teenagers lost in their own mental health struggles? Thank you for joining me on this difficult journey on this case. These cases are not easy to discuss, but they force us to confront uncomfortable truths about society, justice, the way we treat each other, and it really challenges what we think we know. Once we know something, we kind of settle with it. We don't look more for more answers but this world is changing very fast. And these kinds of cases, it will change again and get more complicated. What will we do then? So if nothing else, the story of Conrad and Michelle reminds us that words do matter, and sometimes they do have consequences that may have never been intended. Stay safe out there, guys. Stay out of trouble. And until next time, this is Alexis Knight.